Welcome, everyone. The next item of business is statement by the Care Promise. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on John Swinney for up to 10 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the Independent Care Review published its findings on the 5th of February, and in her statement to Parliament accepting those findings, the First Minister gave a commitment to update Parliament on progress with next steps, and I do so today. While the COVID-19 emergency response has had a significant impact on the priorities of the Scottish Government, we've been working with key partners to ensure that the principles of the Care Review's promise are reflected in our response to the pandemic, including in practice guidance and policies underpinning emergency legislation. The promise set out a vision for what the future of care for Scotland's children and young people could be. It advocates for more intensive, preventative support provided to families in order to keep them together where safe to do so. And where this is not possible, the alternative should provide children with a loving home with positive and lasting relationships and support to thrive. Alongside this, the promise seeks significant changes to the children's hearing system and how we respond to children in conflict with the law. It is clear that achieving this will take a fundamental shift in terms of systems, processes and culture, and it will require all those engaged in supporting children and young people to work to develop and maintain positive relationships so that children feel loved, safe and respected. Whilst we cannot legislate for love, we can help to create a supportive and nurturing environment from which love is possible. Central to this are relationships. The promise aligned to the National Performance Framework and embedded the commitment that Scotland's children grow up loved, safe and respected so they realise their full potential as its vision. The foundations of implementation must maintain this alignment and build on it to shape the required policy and legislation. Presiding Officer, Scotland was invited to sign up to delivering the promise and the significant change it contained, and I'm delighted that so many from across Parliament did so earlier in the year. We also saw support from local government, with the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities saying, and I quote, "Local government welcomes the recommendations from the Independent Care Review and encourages all partners to work together to ensure we build a care system that meets the needs of Scotland's young people." Since the publication of the promise, I have been carefully considering what now needs to happen to deliver the plan. Implementation of the promise requires detailed and complex work across national government, local government and a wide range of partners. I've been heartened to hear that many organisations who will need to make and deliver on commitments to change have been active thinking about what this means for them. I'm under no illusion of how tough some of the conversations that lie ahead will be, particularly when we come to discuss some of the key challenges, such as how we reprofile existing expenditure currently in the system towards more effective outcomes. We also face a major challenge in how we can achieve this in the immediate future. But the principle underpinning the promise is that we do come together to collaborate and think creatively and differently in order to deliver the vision, to agree responsibilities and the timescales to take this forward. Let us not forget that we are emerging from an acute COVID response period. I'm well aware that we're all trying to find our way to a steady state of delivery and a new normal. What I've observed over the past few months is Scotland responding to the COVID emergency in a way which delivers exactly what the promise called for. We've been able to adapt the way in which we all operate to put people and their needs at the front and centre of our conversations with them. So I'm urging all of Scotland's partners who will have a part to play in the delivery of the promise to continue on this path. Along with our work on incorporating the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child into Scots law, which was fully endorsed by the promise, I have been determined that implementation of the promise should not be paused due to the current pandemic. Presiding Officer, on the 5th of February, the First Minister agreed in Parliament to the Care Review's calls for an independent oversight body with at least 50% of its members being care experienced, including its chair. This can also be described as the conscience of the promise, and has an important role in ensuring that those tasked with making the change happen are making good on their promise to implement change. Governance and reporting will also include an annual report submitted to Parliament, and over coming weeks we will see a hive of activity as the recruitment process for the Oversight Board is developed and communicated. A major development on implementing the promise was the appointment of Fiona Duncan as the chair of this new Oversight Board. The Scottish Government has been actively supporting Fiona Duncan to ensure that she has all that she needs to be able to undertake that role. That includes putting in place a support team, which I am pleased includes some of the previous care review team, thereby ensuring that the ethos of that work is built into implementation planning and development. Key to the success of delivering the plan is that the voice of care experience is at its heart in terms of understanding the success and the challenges of how the implementation plan lands on the ground, and also in offering constructive challenge. Only by listening to voices of those who have experienced care can we truly understand the issues and realities and therefore create life-changing solutions. When we get it right, children in care can thrive throughout their lives, they can do well in school, have good mental health and succeed at work. That is why I'm so pleased that Fiona Duncan has started to have those conversations as a priority. We are already seeing examples of partners taking forward the promise and the work influenced by its contents, led by care experienced young people. Children's Hearing Scotland will soon be consulting young people and those who support them about their new children's rights and inclusion strategy. The strategy aims to empower young people and put their voice at the centre of their work to ensure that their views are given real weight in the decision-making process and that they have ownership of their rights. The Scottish Government and the Society of Local Authority Chief Executives have jointly established a Children and Families Collective Leadership Group to consider the impacts of the pandemic on children, young people and families, especially those in the most challenging circumstances, and the actions that need to be taken by local and national government in response. The Promise Chair is part of this group, and a specific focus has been on ensuring that as we progress through the route map, families are able to ask for and receive the support that they need. Access to effective family support can be a critical factor in ensuring that a child's right to be raised safely in their own family remains a reality in all but the most exceptional of circumstances. I have asked the leadership group to look particularly at developing proposals on how we could make this ambition a reality, how we could build on the good practice that already exists across Scotland, and particularly the learning from the sector's response to COVID, where new collaborations and ways of working have helped us to put the needs of families front and centre. Collectively, we already know what good family support looks like and the key factors that characterise it. It should be holistic and empowering for families, rooted in trusting relationships. Help should be early and preventative at whatever level is required, whether that is universally accessible support or more targeted interventions. Above all, we need to recognise that all families, including kinship, adoptive and foster families, need support sometimes. The group have developed a vision and blueprint focused on supporting local services to build on what is working for families in their areas. And where families' needs are not being met, that the sector is supported to find new solutions. I'm grateful to the leadership group for taking forward this work. How we turn this blueprint into reality is our next challenge, and will be a key early step in the implementation of the promise. So I'm pleased that the Promise team will be working with the Scottish Government to drive forward a programme of action based on the group's recommendations. And I'm especially pleased to announce that we have identified initial funding of £4 million to make some early progress on these ambitions. This money will be the first investment in the Promise Fund, a fund which is being established to support early intervention and prevention work across Scotland in line with the implementation of the promise. We know this change was already urgent, and the current situation means Scotland's families need support now. We all recognise the need for ongoing service delivery throughout the process of service redesign. Scotland's families cannot be left waiting for a better reality to come. The Promise Fund will provide start-up funding to enable preventative action and early intervention approaches to be put in place. Over time, the work funded by the Promise Fund will become a key part of our new normal, a normal which supports families where they need it, when they need it, and for as long as they need it, and listens to them when they speak. Now is time for bold, decisive and collective action. We are perfectly placed to collaborate to change the nature and the culture of our approach across all of Scotland's support services, not simply polish the existing system. And to do that, we must all remain accountable to those with lived experience of care. The Promise has created a call to action. It gives us the opportunity to stop and to think about the basics. What do we need to create the society we want and need to be? How do we ensure our children can build and maintain the lasting, trusting relationships which nurture them from childhood to adulthood? I look forward to exploring our collective answers and solutions to these questions. By that route, we can transform the lives of children and young people in our society.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And the Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement. I only have around 20 minutes for that, so can I make a plea for succinct questions and answers, please? And it would be helpful if members would press the R in the chat function if they wish to ask. And I first of all call Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Deputy First Minister for advance sight of the statement and for this important update. The fact we're in recess and virtual must not negatively impact on the conclusions or challenges of the Independent Care Review and the Promise. The Deputy First Minister mentioned children's hearings and that Children's Hearings Scotland will soon be consulting young people and those who support them about their new children's rights and inclusion strategy. Now, since March, children's hearings have been unable to be held face-to-face due to lockdown, and the Centre for Youth and Criminal Justice expressed particular concerns about inevitable delays. So, Deputy First Minister, given the delicate nature of these cases, what steps have been taken to deal with these delays, both to ameliorate them, but also to manage the experience of those subject to them? And finally, when does the Deputy First Minister expect the consultation with young people about the rights and inclusion strategy to start?
John Swinney.
I thank Mr Kerr for his questions. I think he raises an important point that clearly the pandemic has been disruptive to many aspects of public services. In the children's hearings, however, a total of 2,966 hearings have taken place since 23rd March when lockdown began. And I pay tribute to the work of volunteers and of agencies and of families for enabling such a substantial number of hearings to be held in a virtual fashion. That has obviously provided support and assistance and in some cases protection for children as a consequence of these actions, and I think that has been welcome. We are of course now in a position where face-to-face hearings are able to take their course. In relation to the publication of the strategy, this is a matter for Children's Hearings Scotland, but I am assured that they will be taking this forward as an early priority because Children's Hearings Scotland have been really very clear with the Promise team and with the Care Review about the importance of adapting their practice to be consistent with the aspirations of the Promise, and I'm very confident that Children's Hearings Scotland will do exactly that.
Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, and I too would like to thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of the statement, and I agree with him. There is a clear and urgent need to transform the experience and lives of those in our care system, but it's now 4 years since the review was first announced. 1 year since the First Minister set out initial steps in the programme for government, and 5 months since the report was published. So we welcome today's announcement, but can the Cabinet Secretary set out what interim steps have been made since both the programme for government and the publishing of the Care Review report? But more importantly, while we welcome the £4 million to make, and I quote, early progress, can the Cabinet Secretary outline what outcomes are intended with this investment? And indeed, the scale of culture and systemic change that the Cabinet Secretary acknowledged will be required will clearly require further and more significant investment. So can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that this is the Government's intention and outline the scope and scale of future investment that the Scottish Government is preparing to make? Because we all agree that the change that is required for the lives of young, looked after people is an imperative for us all.
John Swinney.
Officer, there's a number of very substantive questions that Mr Johnson has posed to me, and they're all entirely legitimate questions as well. I very much welcome the sentiment that Mr Johnson has conveyed about a shared purpose in improving outcomes for children and young people who have experience of care. And that lies at the heart of what I would readily acknowledge is an immensely challenging report from the Care Review, which I think has produced a significant amount of reflection amongst different organisations and individuals within Scotland, and also an acceptance that current practice has got to change and be reformed. The announcement that I've made today about the early investment in the Promise Fund is essentially to start that process of reform and to encourage organisations to be engaged about how we can repurpose some of the existing resources that are already spent within the system, but to produce better outcomes for children and young people. And fundamentally, that question lies at the heart of our response to the Care Review's report. Because essentially, the Care Review report, and I have to say personally, I found the economic analysis that was produced by the Care Review one of the most compelling pieces of analysis I have read in a long time. Because what it essentially said to us as a country was that we were spending significant amounts of public money, up to £1 billion per annum. And that was essentially producing, not in all circumstances, but in many circumstances, poor outcomes. And that should force us all, and I think the Care Review has prompted this discussion, to reflect on how we could spend that money better to improve outcomes for children and young people. So the investment that we're making is designed to trigger that process. Now, what I think has been instructive during the period of lockdown is that much of the thinking that the Care Review shared with us about focusing on holistic family support, on looking at what can be done better by listening to families, supporting them in their context, addressing some of the difficulties they may face, with the objective of safeguarding those children and supporting families to remain together, has actually been put into practice during lockdown. And I pay tribute to the public authorities who have adapted their practices to do exactly that. And I think that's one very clear example of how the thinking of the Care Review has now been applied in practice within Scotland. Now we're going to have to have an awful lot more of that, and the work of the Promise Fund will be designed to leverage some of that change in the way in which we undertake that public expenditure. And if I use a comparison, a number of years ago, I established in my former role as the Finance Minister a reducing reoffending change fund, which was taken forward by our Justice colleagues. And by collaborative action, focusing on improving outcomes, there's been a significant fall in reoffending levels within Scotland as a consequence of kick-starting investment of this type in the way that we've done with the Promise Fund. So I'm very optimistic that this approach has got a proven track record of working, and I look forward to Fiona Duncan and colleagues taking forward the important steps they've got to take forward.
We now move on to the general questions, and I would repeat my plea for short questions and answers so that everyone gets the opportunity. And Alison Johnson, followed by Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In order to deliver the promise, it's vital that Scotland better understands and gets better at delivering the rights of our young people. So I'd be grateful if the Cabinet Secretary could update where we are exactly on incorporation of the UNCRC into Scots law. And given the even greater challenges that our young people are facing in the current labour market, how will the government help ensure that one of the really important aims highlighted in the Care Review, and that was to create the conditions that enable young care experienced people to thrive in the workplace? How will the government help ensure that that is delivered? I think it's really important that we remember care experienced young people in delivering any jobs guarantee, for example. Thank you.
Swinney.
Presiding Officer, on the question of incorporating the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child into Scots law, the government's intention is to introduce legislation to that effect in the final year of this parliamentary term, and I expect that to be undertaken. Obviously, it will then be for Parliament to scrutinise and consider that legislation in the normal fashion. In relation to the question that Alison Johnson raised with me about the labour market, the Economy Secretary has just given a statement to Parliament about some of the labour market interventions that we will be taking forward in general. It is important that those are inclusive measures, that they reach all sectors of society, and we all know that young people with care experience often require additional support to assist them into the labour market, and we will be working to ensure that every individual who requires particular support, including care experienced young people, is able to receive that.
Rona Mackay, followed by Annie Wales.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very pleased that improving the life chances of care experienced young people has remained a priority throughout this crisis. Could the Deputy First Minister outline further why the Scottish Government made the choice not to pause this work, this important work, during the pandemic?
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, we acknowledged and understood the significance of the care review report when it was published in February. It's given us a very significant insight into the issues and challenges that young people who have experienced care have faced. I was determined, and the government were determined, that notwithstanding the multiple challenges with which members are familiar from COVID, that there was every opportunity taken to advance the agenda that was put forward by the care review. I was delighted that Fiona Duncan was able to take on the role of as the chair of the oversight board, and she is now working in a very focused way to make sure that we have the infrastructure in place to advance the promise. We intend to take this forward at sort of arm's length from government. Fiona Duncan will be given significant scope to carry forward a challenging approach, which will challenge government as well as challenge other organisations, to make sure we have an intensive approach to the implementation of the promise. And I think that's the correct course of action for us to take to ensure that we deliver the swiftest action possible to implement these recommendations.
Annie Wales, followed by James Dornan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The evidence framework published stated there was a case to be made for undertaking work to improve the public understanding of the care system in Scotland. Can I ask, what work is the Scottish Government undertaking to ensure that this happens?
John Swinney.
That work will be integral to the agenda that's taken forward by the Promise team, because what we have to understand, and it relates really back to the question from Daniel Johnson that I answered earlier on, that we do have to refocus the services that we have in place. I think my concern about many of these services, highlighted in the Care Review's report, is that the services do not look in a sufficiently holistic manner at the needs of individual families. And we have to make sure that that holistic family support is available, because by that means we have the greatest possible opportunity to ensure that we address the real underlying challenges that families will face, which may as a consequence result in a child having to have experience of the care system. And we all know that if it can possibly be avoided, it would be better for young people not to end up in that situation. So our focus is very much on understanding and engaging with partners on how they deliver services, with a view to changing the nature of that delivery to meet the aspirations set out in the Care Review report.
James Dornan, followed by Mark Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, the care review, one of the great things about the care review was its unwavering commitment to make sure the care experience community was at its very heart. Does the DFM share my view that the care experience young people must remain at the heart of this process as the next important steps are taken?
Part of the strength of the care review's report was the degree to which it engaged with those with experience of care, and essentially, and it's one of the most powerful examples of this that I've seen in my years in parliamentary politics. It gave very visible voice to those concerns and aspirations. And by securing the contribution and leadership of Fiona Duncan, I was determined to try to take forward that ethos into the implementation work so that we continue to hear those voices in challenging us to do better than we are currently doing. And that's often uncomfortable, and there was many aspects of the care review report which made uncomfortable reading, but it's the right thing to do to make sure that we properly address these issues and deliver remedies and outcomes that are better for the young people concerned. So I give Mr Donnan the assurance that care experienced young people will remain very much at the heart of this process, and of course the Oversight Board is going to be made up of 50% of people who have care experience.
Mark Griffin, followed by Gail Ross.
In the programme for government last September, the government committed to extend eligibility for free NHS dental care to care experienced people, and for those on a qualifying benefit to be supported with discretionary housing payments from April this year. Just wondering if the Cabinet Secretary can say how many people have benefited so far, and if there is any assessment on how many people will benefit in future years.
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, I don't have that detail in front of me today, but I'm very happy to write to Mr Griffin to give him a detailed and specific answer to the points that he's raised with me.
Gail Ross, followed by Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I would also like to put on record my thanks to all the care experienced young people who took part and helped shape this report. Does the Deputy First Minister agree that it's crucial that in cases where staying with family is not possible, children and young people are able to build the supportive and loving relationships that everyone needs to grow and thrive?
John Swinney.
I think this is perhaps by far the greatest challenge that exists for us in addressing the evidence that's been put in front of us by care experienced young people, because the aspirations that Gail Ross has set out are the aspirations of those care experienced young people, and we have to make sure that we put in place the practical steps that enable such an approach to take place. And that is complex and challenging, and it relies, of course, on the engagement of individuals who are able to create that loving and supportive environment for young people. So our approach is designed to strengthen and to support families by taking the preventative approach that I expressed earlier on, but then also to make sure that where that is not successful, we are able to put in place all of the support that will enable young people to have that experience. And whilst challenging, it must remain the central focus of what we're trying to do to produce the best life chances for those young people, and they deserve to have the best life chances.
Brian Whittle, followed by John Mason.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Good afternoon, Cabinet Secretary. I mean, we know within the current pandemic that children are not being seen on a daily basis by the trained eyes of teachers, and there is that concern around the children who live in the most challenging of circumstances. I wonder, Cabinet Secretary, with the teachers who are trying to keep in contact with pupils, but there are those families and pupils who are not responding. I wonder if you could highlight how the Scottish Government would intend to engage with authorities to ensure safety of all children and families in this situation.
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, let me try to reassure Mr Whittle on the legitimate issues that he has raised. For children in the most at-risk circumstances, we have been regularly monitoring throughout the lockdown the proportion of those young people who were contacted by professionals to be assured of their security and their safety. And it has been an improving. It was a very, to be very fair to local authority staff, it was a very strong position to begin with. The first data set, if my memory serves me right, indicated that very close to 90% of children with a child protection plan were being seen or contacted by professionals. That figure for the most recent week that's available, the 8th of July, was 97%, and it has been well into the 90% for many, many weeks. It's probably been in the 90% since early to mid-April. So those in the most at-risk category have been receiving support. Obviously, the point that Mr Whittle raises is material to being able to resume full-time schooling, and as colleagues will know, that is my planning assumption, and on which to which the government and our local authority partners are working, because what that then opens up is the opportunity for us to offer more and more support to young people who may be in a position of vulnerability and who desperately need to receive that support. So we will be working to ensure that over the course of the next few weeks, we are able to secure that outcome.
I still have 4 members who wish to ask a question. I can run on for a couple of minutes, but please be short in questions and answers so that we can get everyone in. John Mason, followed by Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think there has been a certain amount of stigma around care experienced young people. I just wonder if the Deputy First Minister can make any suggestions as to how elected politicians like ourselves or local councillors can help deal with that.
John Swinney.
I think what we can do most effectively is make sure that we all put our efforts into creating the type of holistic support environment that I've talked about, because the care review will only be successfully implemented if government, our local authority partners, a range of third sector organisations and a whole range of public servants focus on the needs and the interests of children and families who are in difficulty. And if we do so, we have the best chance of overtaking of addressing the challenges that they face. So that would be my plea today, and I'm delighted with the degree of cross-party support that has come forward to the work of the care review. I think it is well justified by the nature and the significance of the challenge, and I look forward to working with colleagues to try to do as much as we can to secure that objective, and I remain very open to the contributions of members of other parties as to how we can do that most effectively.
Beatrice Wishart, followed by Joanne Lamont.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary knows that we very much support the work of the care review, and research seems to indicate with the pandemic that 18 to 24-year-olds are most likely to have lost work or income, and while young people have relied on the safety net of moving in with families, care experienced young people don't always have that support that others take for granted. So what early work's been done to look at the consequences of the pandemic for care experienced young people, and are the support systems up to recognising and responding to their circumstances?
John Swinney.
Many of these issues need to be addressed within these specific considerations of employment support, but it's not just about employment support, because I think, as Beatrice Wishart fairly points out, there can be a collateral implication of loss of employment on perhaps the inability to sustain housing, and then if an individual loses housing, then we essentially move into a very turbulent and volatile period. So the advice and guidance that we've issued, and the practice, I have to say, that I've seen emerging from a range of different organisations, is all designed to ensure that we have in place that holistic support that addresses the needs of individuals and ensures that their unique circumstances as care-experienced individuals can be properly and fully addressed, so that they can go on to have successful lives despite the fact that they may have a negative experience of the loss of employment as a consequence of the pandemic.
Joanne Lamont, followed by Bill Kidd.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wanted to follow on from the question from Beatrice Wishart and to ask what work is being undertaken to understand the particular impact of the lockdown on care-experienced young people. I think we all fear that it may be disproportionately detrimental to them. What specific actions have been taken to support care-experienced young people as they return to school, to indeed ensure that they do return to school, whether they're going on to further or higher education, or are facing the challenge of joining the world of work? And perhaps you could outline if there will be specific resources provided to ensure that that support will be real for young care-experienced people.
John Swinney.
I think it's absolutely critical in how we respond to the economic difficulties created by the pandemic that we address the particular circumstances of young people with different background experiences, and that obviously includes those with the experience of care. And in the equalities work that the government is taking forward to make sure that our response adequately addresses all of those issues that are addressed that are identified in the equalities assessment, is vital that we turn that into practical reality. We'll obviously be engaging the care review team on what particular interventions can make the biggest difference in supporting young people with experience of care, to enable them to enter the labour market, or if necessary to pursue other training and educational opportunities, which will have to be a course of action taken by a range of individuals given the level of economic disruption and the level of unemployment that we expect to be forthcoming. So we have to focus on the experience of those individuals. We also have to recognise that in an economic downturn, history tells us that those who are furthest away from the labour market in good times will go even further away from the labour market in the tough times. And we have to make sure that for care-experienced young people, that is not the route that they experience.
And the last very quick question, please, from Bill Kidd.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline what measures the Scottish Government will use to track progress on implementing the recommendations in the independent review of care report, and will the Scottish Government report to Parliament on this?
A quick answer would be appreciated, Mr Swinney.
We've accepted that there should be an annual report to Parliament, and we've also accepted that the Oversight Board should be very challenging if it does not believe that sufficient progress has been made in a timely fashion to address these recommendations, and the Government willingly volunteers for that scrutiny.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. And that concludes the Ministerial Statement on the Care Promise. And this meeting is suspended.